My name is Susan Edwards. I'm the Executive Director of the Museum of Old Newbury, and welcome tonight to Watching the Moon, as we fondly call it. Tonight, it's a pleasure to welcome my colleague, Tom Denenberg, who is the director of the Shelburne Museum in Shelburne, Vermont. Before going to Vermont, Tom served as chief curator and deputy director of the Portland, Maine Museum of Art. And before that, he was curator of American Decorative Arts at the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, Connecticut. Tom received his BA in history from Bates College and earned his PhD in American Studies from Boston University. He has held fellowships at Winterthur and the Smithsonian and taught at BU, Harvard, and Wake Forest. Tom has numerous publications to his credit, including my favorite, Wallace Nutting and the Invention of Old America. Please join me in welcoming Tom Denenberg.
Oh, thank you, Susan. And thank you for having me. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm a big fan of your organization. I hope everyone can hear me. If you can't, please put that in the chat and we'll work something out there. But Susan and I are longtime colleagues from the great state of Maine, so it's wonderful to be here with you tonight. Not so long ago, wrote Wallace Nutting, who we see here in his 1925 portrait by William Loring. Not so long ago, it was impossible to purchase a natural, tasteful picture without going to great expense. Fine art was simply beyond the reach of most Americans. There were millions, he continued, who knew beauty when they saw it, but could not indulge in the works of old masters or even new masters for that matter. As for more affordable media, the erstwhile minister pulled no punches. The watercolors of 20 years ago were numerous, he said, and shall we say, shocking. Domestic art, for all but the wealthy, consisted of one form of simulation or another. In the waning decades of the 19th century. Mass-produced statuary, like this John Rogers group depicting a scene from Longfellow, Why Don't You Speak for Yourself, John Alden, provided a sentimental conversation piece for the parlor. Chromolithographs and inexpensive stenciled landscapes adorn the walls of countless middle-class homes. But the diffusion of a modern artistic sensibility, a modernist artistic sensibility, in the years after, or bracketing the turn of the century, profoundly altered these popular notions of authenticity and integrity. Although chromolithographs, were promoted as democratic, educational, and uplifting in the last quarter of the 19th century, critics grumbled about their derivative nature. As early as 1870, the nation weighed in on the issue. The chromolithographic imitation of the oil painting is a type of art that is most disgusting to the artist and to the cultivated, they wrote. And this, of course, is a chromolithograph after an Eastman Johnson painting of husking from just before the Civil War. By 1900, for the work to be art, for the object to be understood as art, it required the singular touch of an artist. It actually had to be manipulated by an individual. Etchings passed mustered and print clubs flourished, but the simple demographics of a rapidly expanding nation created novel and really unprecedented tensions between the ideals of high art and access to the real thing. So not everyone can afford that sort of singular work of art. The question of appropriate subject matter also proved to be equally complicated in this moment. And again, this is, last decade or two of the 19th century, first decade of the 20th. As daily life evolved into a series of encounters with institutions rather than individuals, nostalgia became endemic. The new middle class, mourning a perceived loss of social economy, so face-to-face interactions, and caught in what historians have described as the weightless flux of modernity, craved the stability accorded by history and tradition. They traveled to historic sites, collecting antiques, once the sort of eccentric behavior became a normal pastime, a normative pastime. The new middle class desired an art that was at once authentic and available, but also historically referential. And I'm offering you Edward Lamson Henry's The Old Clock at the Stairs here as sort of a trope, an archetype of this sort of imagery that we began to see in the decades after the Civil War and until this moment at the turn of the century. Here again, it's clearly part of a literary reference to Longfellow, The Clock at the Head of the Stairs. So it's part of this literary historical complex that we find in the decades after the great conflict that was the Civil War. And I think it's important to remember in this era, and particularly, thinking about Longfellow, since I've, referenced him twice now, that this was a moment where we see the rise of the schoolhouse poets, Longfellow, Whittier, and history is learned in verse. So you have this kind of sing-song way of absorbing historical tales about a relatively new country, and I think that's an important way of kind of embedding these images and this visual culture within a larger literary culture. This is, the moment where you would be going to public schools and you would be reciting, "Listen, children, you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere." And so this is all kind of a, very tightly referential historical moment for the United States. Now, our answer, or the answer tonight, for this kind of demographic problem, because only a few people can afford a painting like Edward Lanston Henry here. This answer proved to be a hybrid genre embedded in what I would call a cult of personality. Hand-tinted photographs became a middle-class art. Wallace Nutting became America's new old master. And I like that quote where he talked about new masters and old masters. Nutting's platinum prints, one of which you see here, the initial offering in what became a historically themed consumer empire by the 1920s, came to hold a dominant place in American visual culture for close to 3 decades. Signed, matted, and framed, these sentimental views appealed to an audience seeking that traditional, historically suggestive aesthetic for the home. The softly hued photographs offered consumers a middling kind of art, a middling genre of art, more respectable than the chromolithograph, yet far less expensive than that easel painting that we saw just a moment ago. Now, photography made Wallace Nutting into a household name. By the time the 1920s began to roar, the erstwhile clergyman's fluid signature could be found coast to coast throughout the middle-class American home, penciled on photographs. And those of you who are familiar with Wallace Nutting photographs or collect Wallace Nutting photographs, you know how he penciled his signature on and then later inked it on. Branded into reproduction colonial furniture, like you see here, this block front chest, and printed on the title page of some 16 books and innumerable magazines, including the House Beautiful, the Magazine Antiques, and the Saturday Evening Post. Historically minded consumers could keep track of the days on Wallace Nutting calendars, send season's greetings on Wallace Nutting Christmas cards, and even visit 5 restored museum houses operating under the Wallace Nutting banner in 3 New England states. And those of you I know in Newbury and Newburyport are very, very familiar with one of these houses, and we'll get to that in a few moments. The peripatetic cleric himself could be found preaching to audiences throughout the United States on the idealized values of a time and place he called Old America. Old America, Wallace Nutting's Old America, was a deft combination of myth and materialism, and it served as a kind of master narrative for the minister's interconnected, historically minded business and scholarly endeavors. An evocative melange of invented traditions, Old America provided the entrepreneurial cleric with a tap into the growing consumer culture of the early 20th century. Part halcyon sermon and part corporate facade, Old America provided the forum for Wallace Nutting, the minister, to become, in capital letters, Wallace Nutting, the registered trademark. Nutting's rise to prominence, national prominence, is an unlikely story, and one that the minister himself put to good use as he marketed his personality in the earliest decades of the 20th century. Born on the eve of the Civil War and left fatherless by the conflict, born in 1861, Nutting shuttled between relatives in New England and the Midwest. He spent time in Maine, he moved out to the Midwest. In 1876, he attended the Philadelphia Centennial, where large-scale displays of national pride in the form of nostalgic tableaus, like the New England Kitchen and exhibitions of revolutionary relics, the Fuller cradle that once rocked on the Mayflower, you see it here in the New England Kitchen, John Alden's desk, and George Washington's field equipment, elicited widespread comment in the popular press. After clerking for a spell in a Boston emporium, Nutting attended Exeter, Harvard, and the Hartford and Union Theological Seminaries in training for the ministry. Heading off to a life of service to the Congregational Church in cities such as Minneapolis, Newark, New Jersey, and Seattle, Nutting soon developed the kind of the bane of the Victorian thinking classes. He developed neurasthenia, or a case of the nerves. Agitated to the point of exhaustion, Wallace Nutting turned to his hobbies in search of therapeutic relaxation. Nutting and his wife, Marriott Griswold Caswell Nutting, toured the mountains and the coast of New England. And this was a moment where sort of the early tourist industry in New England was really understood to be a kind of a therapeutic pastime. Doctors would literally prescribe, go to the White Mountains, go to the coast of Maine. They joined the throngs who took up the safety bicycle as a way of taking in the fresh air. And of course, the safety bicycle was a revolutionary bit of technology after the penny farthings of the earlier 19th century. The fact that the two wheels were the same size, and women could ride bicycles in their costumes, their skirts, with a degree of confidence that they weren't going to fall over. Nutting became a dedicated amateur photographer in this era, and that's also something that's very, very typical, which is that people would often ride their bicycles out from town, bring their camera with them. One good friend of mine often refers to this as the camera cure. That again, doctors would literally prescribe people to take up photography as a therapeutic hobby to combat the nerves or neurasthenia. Nutting became a dedicated amateur photography, working in the pictorial mode that you see here, contributing to magazine competitions and exhibiting his work in a small print shop in Providence. Images that you see here, this is called House on Harvard's Hill, are typical of these early efforts. Nutting often pedaled out from Providence when he was still serving as a minister early in the week after his Sunday sermon, and he would find these hoary old houses to document. And so it's this combination of historical consciousness and this new technology of photography, which we see on full display here. Nothing worked to soothe his nerves, however, and Nutting stepped down from the pulpit of the Union Congregational Church in Providence in 1904. And this is the funny part. Seeking peace and quiet, Nutting and his wife moved to New York City, where they lasted exactly 1 year. After a year in Manhattan, living in a studio on 23rd Street, so Lower Manhattan, and trying to turn his avocation of photography into an artistic career, Nutting, sicker than ever, more agitated, more nervous than ever, fled the city and became an acolyte of the country life movement. He moved up the rail line, sort of up Long Island Sound, to Southbury, Connecticut, and he purchased a derelict farm in 1905. And you see that here. Nutting restored the house and made a go of becoming a gentleman farmer, purchasing livestock and constructing an elaborate cattle barn just over the hill from the main house. It's actually kind of a fun story. In some of these images of this very negative, the barn actually exists and they're touched out, and retouched out, and we'll get to that part of the narrative in just a moment. We get a sense of what kind of farm the Nuttings kept by reading a passage from his 1936 autobiography. The cattle were selected for the beauty of black and white banding, the horses we bought for their handsome heads, the sheep and lambs because we loved them. If an animal would not pose for a picture, it was not for us. So this whole kind of interest in farming as an aesthetic pastime, an aesthetic pursuit, is really something that's so encoded in Wallace Nutting's activities at this house. This kind of agrarian dilettantism gave way to economic necessity, however, and Nutting increasingly turned to photography as his means of support. Obviously, if you're choosing the animals, for the beauty of their banding, it's probably not a strong economic model as a farmer. He published ever larger catalogs of his platinum prints in 1906, 1908, and 1912. By 1912, consumer demand was so great that the catalog reached 97 pages in length and contained approximately 900 images with extensive commentaries. So if you can kind of imagine opening up one of these catalogs and there's a a sort of a tone to the minister's language describing these photographs. Now, this is where the story really begins to pick up speed and get interesting. To meet demand, Nutting hired a group of young women from the surrounding countryside, and he converted that house, Nuttingham. And again, these names that he gave his properties are always these sort of wonderful, sort of Anglophilic, English-sounding, historically laden names. He converted Nuttingham into a compound that approximated the arts and crafts communes that were springing up in places like East Aurora, New York, Rose Valley, Pennsylvania, and New Clairvaux, Massachusetts. Nutting wrote of the change, quote, "When my picture venture grew, we moved out from the house, cleansed the cement basement floor where the farm animals had been kept, and finished the barn above into 2 stories. The first for workrooms, the second for dormitories for the girls from a distance who colored the pictures. With a chaperone and a cook, we had under one roof, dormitory, studio, offices, and in the basement storage." So if you think about this, Nutting was creating this kind of communal work, live situation for these young women in Nuttingham. Nutting organized this his barn studio, after the vertical assembly lines favored by the early automobile industry, early automobile manufacturers. So they would move black and white prints, which were printed out multiple negatives per sheet of platinum paper, platinum impregnated paper, past colorists' workstations, and then on to the framing department. And here you see the method by which Nutting printed out multiple copies at a time, multiple images at a time. And Nuttings, as they were fairly soon called, could be had in a number of different sizes, from small 2 by 3 inches to these great 20 by 30 photographs, all drop shipped from Southbury, Connecticut. I hope you can make sense of the image that you see in front of you. It's basically a series of these glass plate negatives that Nutting had, which would then be laid down on the platinum paper and exposed to the sun. Platinum print technology is something that, now that we live in the digital age, we've fetishized slightly, but it's actually a fairly straightforward and easy sort of process because there's no enlarger. You basically just expose the paper to the sun, and then you control the contrast and the tone in the chemicals in the developer. So it's kind of tailor-made for mass production, and that's what Nutting exploited really rapidly in this moment as he grew his business. Now, production reaped immediate profit. By 1914, Nutting's operation had outgrown that converted cow barn. The minister and his colorists relocated to Framingham, Massachusetts, and it was from there that Nutting issued his largest catalog, the so-called expansible edition of 1915. And I really like that made-up word. It's expansible. It's not expandable. It's not, an accordion edition or anything like that. It's expansible. It gives you this great sort of sense of his vision for where he's going in 1915. Employing a clever, flexible binding and an open system of stock numbers with little regard for pagination. So those of you who've seen expansible catalogs, you'll know that he was just interleaving different sections as he went. Nutting could add to the catalog at any time without the expense of reprinting a bound volume. So those earlier photo catalogs that he issued in 1912 and earlier, those were bound tightly. Whereas the expansible edition was this kind of open mechanical binding, so he could just add to it at any time. By the time of the expansible catalog, Nutting was selling these photographs hand over fist. He claimed at one point to be doing $1,000 of business a week. $1,000 of business a week in 1915, 1916. And I think it bears kind of noting as a comparison, this is an era when a doctor or a lawyer might be making $7,000 or $8,000 a year if they are successful. So that gives you a sense of the scale of this operation. Now, Nutting offered an image to fit every aesthetic and a picture to fit every budget. There were views of abbeys and cathedrals from his European travels, mountains and streams from northern New England, bridges and blossoms from Connecticut, winding roads and pastoral scenes. All in all, he offered 19 categories of domestic art photograph in the expansable edition. They sold for between $1.25 and $20, depending on the size and the frame option. Now, by way of comparison, an Impressionist work from 1920, Willard Metcalf, Captain Lord House, could command several thousand dollars. So this gives you the kind of sense of where Nutting fit in the market. And again, as we kind of talked about this, expanding middle class, this middle class of Americans who are interested in history and interested in New England, interested in place, you'll see how Nutting offers the same imagery as Willard Metcalf, but at a completely different price point. Approximately 20% of the 1915 catalog was dedicated to one category, and this is all important, what Nutting called his personals or his colonials. These costume tableaus became Nutting's bread and butter throughout the teens, the World War I years, and well into the 1930s. Although Nutting exposed thousands of different colonials, two broad themes organized the rubric. In a world of new women, and remember, think this is the 1920s, in a world of new women, office girls, suffragettes, and flappers, Nutting's female models were invariably posed in two extremely culturally conservative modes, the genteel and the productive. They are good wives, spinning again like Longfellow's Priscilla from the courtship of Miles Standish and Whittier's mother in Snowbound, or they are 18th century ladies of leisure, objects in the interior, literally themselves objects in the interior, not unlike a chest, a chair, a stand, or the looking glass that you see here. They are archetypes of traditional female behavior, and it comes as no surprise in a world where this was being challenged, where the boundaries were being pushed at every turn. And it comes as no surprise, therefore, to discover that Nutting colonials were often given as wedding gifts. And I can't tell you how many times after giving a talk like this, someone would tell me my grandmother was given one of these on her wedding, for her wedding present. Nutting intended these colonials, his colonials, to be prescriptive. And that's why they were given, as wedding gifts. As one trope within the visual culture of the early 20th century, Nutting's views of women served as the delivery system for the imagery of the Boston school painters into mass culture. Like the far more rarefied artistic expressions of Edmund Tarbell, Frank Benson, or Joseph Rodeford de Camp, the minister's interiors are hermetic environments rife with symbolic objects that celebrate quiescence in the female sphere. Unlike the passive props, however, employed by other historically minded image makers like Tarbell and Benson, Nutting found a way to animate these objects. And I think it's always, instructive to do a close look at this painting. Here we have, two daughters in the household. They're obviously looking at, some ancestral object, a silver teapot. They're sitting on an ancestral sofa because they're obviously, women of the teens or 20s, but everything around them is making reference to the history of the family. And that's what these Boston school painters were so very good at doing, at literally painting these sort of history lessons for the home, and history lessons particularly for these young women. Now, unlike again, a Tarbell or a Metcalf or an Edward Lamson Henry, and these are rarefied objects that only very few could afford, Nutting finds a way to provide these for a broad middle class. And Nutting, as I mentioned before, found a way to all of a sudden kind of make these objects dance a little bit in his imagery, in his photographs. And we'll talk about that next. Authenticity is the key word for the next chapter of the Wallace Nutting story. Concerned that those colonials, his colonials, taken in private homes, lacked authenticity or veracity, Nutting sought out worthy institutional partners. He exposed a series of images in the Cooper Frost Austin House, one of which you see here, which was, I believe, the first acquisition from the fledgling Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, which is now, of course, Historic New England. And after much correspondence about the possibility of a joint venture with the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, The minister's relationship with William Sumner Appleton, who had the wonderful title of corresponding secretary. He was one of the founders of SPNEA, but he called himself the corresponding secretary. The relationship between the two men went south, it soured. In a textbook case of vertical expansion, to say nothing of petulance, Nutting moved to assemble his own collection of house museums, modestly calling this initiative or this endeavor the Wallace Nutting chain of colonial picture houses. So pay attention there that, Nutting first thought that he was going to be able to use SPNEA's buildings and decorate them, furnish them, and sell his photographs. But at a certain point, that didn't work out, and he decides that he's going to sort of integrate his business activity vertically by buying his own structures. The chain of houses came to comprise 5 buildings in 3 New England states, purchased by the minister between 1914 and 1916. With the chain, Nutting organized an automobile tour of 17th and 18th century architecture by including structures such as the Joseph Webb House in Wethersfield, Connecticut, the Wentworth Gardner House in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, as you see here, the Hazen Garrison in Haverhill, Massachusetts, the Cutler Bartlett House, which I'm sure you all know, in Newburyport, and the Ironmaster's House in Saugus. When I was first working on Nutting years ago, I just thought automobile tour, 1915, 1916, what kind of sense does that make? How many cars can there possibly be? Well, by coincidence, in 1915, Henry Ford produced his millionth automobile. And registrations for car licenses were up in dramatic fashion right on the eve of World War I. So that kind of brass and gas touring car scene of the early 20th century was really what Nutting was aiming for with this moment. He understood that people were no longer just sort of bound by the steamer routes or the train routes that were taking tourists back to northern New England, but people were able to sort of move around in these historic towns by automobile by 1914 and 1915. One of my favorite maps of New England it's actually kind of a map/railroad schedule, and it's from the summer of 1865. So if we just go back, a generation. And the reason I like it so much is basically what it's doing is it's pointing out all of the vacation hotspots in New England, the White Mountains, the coast of Maine, and it shows you how to get there. So it's basically the tourist roadmap to New England. And what I find so fascinating is it was published right at the end of the Civil War. And the reason that's so interesting is the development of the rail lines, bringing, manufactured goods to the warfront to south, where it was inverted. Those rail lines were inverted, and all of a sudden you have tourists going north. So New England becomes a kind of a therapeutic, historic pleasure ground in the latter decades of the 19th century. And then what Wallace Nutting is doing is kind of detailing in this specificity where all of a sudden people can get in cars and go to these buildings. Now, I want to dive in for a few moments to the story of the Ironmaster's house, because I think that's really indicative of how Nutting envisioned this. Nutting buys these buildings, and he undertook extensive and creative restoration at each property. He employed a architect named Henry Charles Dean, who went by the name Harry Dean. And I've been thinking a lot about Harry Dean in recent months because it's a very poignant story. He dies in the Spanish influenza, the flu influenza of 1919 at age 33. So he was one of the consulting architects who helped William Sumner Appleton with the early work at Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, along with Norman Isham and Joseph Everett Chandler. But we don't know Henry Charles Dean all that well because he died so young. But he was the consultant on the Ironmaster's house, and he drew the plans. And you'll see that this is the building as Nutting purchased it. And then, of course, this is the building after Henry Charles Dean and Wallace Nutting were finished with the Ironmaster's house. William Sumner Appleton from Historic New England visited the project several times, and he took these in-progress restoration photographs. This is around back on the L. And then we also have extant these wonderful drawings by Henry Charles Dean, Harry Dean, for the plan for how this building, was to look when it was finished. So very clear that Wallace Nutting was not afraid to substantially alter the historic fabric of these buildings to fit his vision of what an accurate 17th or 18th century house should look like. Nutting also took a bit of artistic license at the Joseph Webb House in Wethersfield, Connecticut, when he introduced a series of these. And here is the Joseph Webb House on Main Street in Wethersfield, Connecticut. The Webb Dean Stevens compound of houses is now a museum owned by the Colonial Dames, of course. But Nutting was not above taking artistic license with these restorations, particularly in the Webb House, where he includes a series of these somewhat fanciful wall murals in the parlor. And the reason I call them fanciful is you can see that he's actually included the Hazen Garrison house on the wall of the parlor of the Webb House. So he's basically created the narrative of this automobile tour in the first house that you would come to if you were driving up from New York, which is in Wethersfield, Connecticut. So the idea was this is the portal to Wallace Nutting's Old America, and then you should then go on to visit the rest of these structures like the Hazen Garrison House. So I'm quite sure that the Webb House did not have scenic wallpaper or a wall mural of the Hazen Garrison House in the 18th century, but it did when Wallace Nutting was finished with it. Another wonderful document that I'm very fond of is this newspaper clipping from July 3rd, right before the holiday, 1916. Historic Webb House restored by Wallace Nutting, artist who has restored historic Webb House in Wethersfield. So it's all about how, and here's your other headline, the artist takes it back to the old days. So Nutting by 1916 was also so very familiar with how to get his word out, how to market his endeavor, and also how to make use of PR, public relations, here in the case of this newspaper. Not only did each kind of link in the chain, each building, each house in the chain of colonial picture houses serve as a backdrop for Nutting's photographs, but each played a role in the growing consumer empire of Old America. The Cutler Bartlett house, so your house, served as an exhibition space for those platinum prints, those platinotypes, literally a gallery up on the second floor. And the Saugus property evolved into a fascinating compound that uncovers the very modern underpinnings of Old America. In Saugus, oh, and here's upstairs parlor of the Cutler Bartlett house, and you see how it was decorated with period furniture, so Nutting's original collection. But then if you peer out through the hallway there, you'll see a platinum print on the wall, and then over, of course, to the right as well, you'll see it. So Nutting is using this as a kind of historic house / cum gallery, photography gallery. So moving to Saugus for a moment, nearby Saugus, Nutting established a forge. Here we go. Nutting established a forge, second photography studio, and a furniture factory in Saugus, and he christened this property Broadhearth. So again, remember Nuttingham was the house in Southbury, and this is now Broadhearth. The smithy at Broadhearth, provided an active stage for the performance of traditional craftsmanship by Nutting's English blacksmith. He had a blacksmith named Edward Guy, Mr. Guy, who worked for him in Saugus. And there's a fascinating little backstory there because Edward Guy and Wallace Nutting eventually had a split. This seems to be a pattern with Wallace Nutting. I think he had extremely high standards when it came to the relationships that he kept. And Mr. Guy was so upset by the split, the business torn asunder between the two of them, that he issued an open letter in the 1920s where he claimed that Nutting was faking some of the objects that he was then publishing. And he claimed that he knew this because he made them himself. Mr. Guy claimed that they were his own work. The photography studio in Saugus dramatically increased the minister's production capacity. Mr. Guy's work, as a blacksmith, also kind of added objects to the catalogs, and you'll see them interleaved into the back of furniture catalogs. The real story in Saugus, however, was the furniture factory that Nutting established in the old Scott woolen mill just next door to the ironmaster's house in 1917. So in 1917, Wallace Nutting goes into the furniture business. Having gathered a sizable collection of furniture, and some of that we saw in the Cutler Bartlett house upstairs and in the other properties, the Webb house and Hayes and Garrison. Having gathered a sizable collection of furniture and domestic accessories to use as props in his colonials and to decorate the chain of colonial picture houses, Nutting prototyped them by making full-scale photographs, remember he's a photographer, and measured drawings, gridded off measured drawings and templates, and he went into the reproduction furniture business. In an early manifesto of integrated marketing, Wallace Nutting wrote, quote, "Those who know the pictures want the chairs." So he was very, very, clear in his vision. Those who know the pictures, my pictures, want the chairs. Now here again, integration is the key word. Time and time again, Nutting employed a sophisticated pattern of marketing and production with his business lines. In 1917, he authored a guidebook to American Windsor furniture, a little kind of bird book, if you will, one of the first specialty texts on the subject that I know of. A year later, he issued a catalog offering, and here's the catalog, a catalog offering dozens of Windsor chairs in a number of historic styles. All along, tourists could visit the originals in his chain of houses for a 25-cent admission fee. In this way, Nutting organized the market by publishing that little book, the history book on Windsor chairs, created demand by opening up the chain of colonial picture houses, and then he filled orders by way of these catalogs. Now, Nutting sold these tangible history lessons for the home by using the most up-to-date methods. He issued mail-order catalogs from Saugus and later Framingham when he consolidated all of his businesses in Framingham in the early 1920s. He made widespread use of the department stores as arbiters of taste and purveyors of home furnishings throughout the country. Here you see the display window, a display window of a store in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. But it just as easily could have been the Brandeis store in Omaha, Nebraska, G. Fox in Hartford, Connecticut, John Wanamaker's in New York City, or Mettee and Sons in Baltimore. And these are all department stores that 20 some odd years ago, I found records or references that they sold the Wallace Nutting line of furniture. Note the cross-marketing that goes on in this department store window. And see that Windsor chair there? And look at the placard on the Windsor chair and says, "The pictures are the jewels of the home." So this whole kind of idea that you're going to be able to go to a department store and buy a Windsor chair or a 17th century Carver chair you see just in the background, or any of these photographs is really sort of how Wallace Nutting organized his business. I found, again, many years ago, some wonderful records for that department store in Baltimore, Mettee and Son. And what was so very interesting there is it showed how Nutting would also make these personal appearances in town as a way of drumming up business. He often would arrive by train on a Saturday into a town or a city. On Sunday, he would offer to be a guest minister at a local church. And then on Monday, he would often sort of open the new product line at the department store. So when Wallace Nutting came to town, he kind of, really created a great deal of activity around his business endeavors. Nutting also advertised widely in this period. A scrapbook of his print ads survives, and it is hard to not see the irony in the fact that the George Batten Company of Madison Avenue held the Nutting account. And I was so surprised when I was going through this account book and I found these little sort of buck sheets from a clipping service. And they were clipped to the top of these ads. And it said George Batten Company. And so clearly the advertising agency was keeping track of when and where their ads appeared in magazines and newspapers. And I suspect some of you will recognize the name Batten, George Batten, because he eventually became the first B in B.B.D.&O., Batten, Barton, Durstein, and Osborne, which I believe survived as the largest advertising agency for much of the 20th century. So this promotion offering beauty, construction, and style, and this one ran in Antiques magazine repeatedly in the 1920s, but it could have been in one of those other shelter magazines like House Beautiful. Nutting was a frequent contributor to Antiques magazine and other sort of shelter and domestic magazines of this era, and he played a very important role in organizing the Americana marketplace of the 1920s. But here again, I love this sort of irony that, here's a minister, come sort of somehow cast an amber back from the halcyon days of the past, but he's using the very up-to-date methods of a Madison Avenue ad shop and department stores to sell these goods. Now, throughout this time period, Nutting expanded his anti-modern conglomerate. His catalogs outgrew the Pilgrim Century aesthetic you see here, represented by what he called the number 910 Sudbury cupboard. And this is named after a 17th century cupboard that he found in Sudbury, Massachusetts, and he reproduced several times. This version is in the collection of the Wadsworth Athenaeum, but there's another version now at Historic New England, the successor organization to the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. Nutting outgrew this kind of aesthetic represented by the 17th century furniture, and he began to produce 18th century forms following the kind of public taste, such as this copy of a mahogany desk, or actually this is just a block front chest, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City in the American wing in the 1920s, as it's opened and becomes a sort of a popular spot in the American zeitgeist, historical zeitgeist of this era. His access to collections such as those of the American wing signifies his rising stature as an antiquarian and really cultural critic in the 1920s. In 1921, Nutting published the furniture of the Pilgrim Century, and in 1924, he entered into an agreement with J.P. Morgan Jr. that saw his extensive collection, Nutting's extensive collection, transferred to the Wadsworth Athenaeum that year, basically in response to the Metropolitan's Museum of Art's organization of the American wing just a couple of years earlier. I'm always sort of amused that Morgan Jr. deinstalled a number of his father's European collections from this building at the Athenaeum. It was known as the Morgan Memorial Building, and he installed the Americana collection. So there's this interesting intergenerational tension, I think, between father and son Morgan. Morgan Jr. wanted nothing to do with his father's European Grand Tour objects, and wanted to really create a red, white, and blue all-American installation in Dad's building. Nutting published his magnum opus, The Furniture Treasury, in 1928. And a tome that remained a standard reference book for generations. And again, 25 years ago or so, when I was working on Nutting in earnest in graduate school, I remember Jerry Ward was then the curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And Jerry made the point to me that, the Furniture Treasury and Furniture of the Pilgrim Century had rarely been out of print in the course of the 20th century. They were reprinted, the publishers went out of business, new publishers would pick up the books. And so these were, germinal, foundational books for the study of American furniture throughout the 20th century. Now, Nutting's stature and his pocketbook increased with the publication of the state's beautiful books, travel books in the 1920s. And these are fascinating to me because they're basically a catch-all of reused text from the minister's late 19th century sermons and recycled photographs from his earlier expansable catalog. The State's Beautiful books updated an earlier rubric of rustic travelogue that was popular at the turn of the century, and they did so by, sort of leaning heavily on the imagery of Nutting's catalog. So he was able to, place you in upland Vermont, place you on the coast of Maine, place you on the coast of Massachusetts, literally in his text and his images. They help define these books taken as a group, because they're a series, and this is the first edition and the second edition you see here of Pennsylvania Beautiful. They help define New England and other worthy states like Pennsylvania and Virginia and New York as venerable places, venerable regions, despite the hustle and bustle of modern life in the 1920s. They also concretized Nutting's image and reputation and made old America really what it was, which is to say a close ancestor of the biography-based corporations that have proven to be so popular in the era of the 1920s and 30s. So as we kind of wrap up here, I want you to think about the chain of colonial picture houses as, the precursor to Wallace Nutting's Magic Kingdom. I want you to think of Wallace Nutting's Old America, if you will, as a harbinger of Martha Stewart's brand of living. Wallace Nutting's images, objects, and texts, and probably one of the sort of great examples is this shell-carved mahogany desk and bookcase that you see here. Nutting's images, objects, and texts, from moralizing platinotypes, those colonials of women in traditional garb, to authentic 18th century furniture that you see here, fed upon one another to create a seamless narrative of colonial forms that made a virtue for the past in the modern era. In this way, Nutting employed this fantasy, if you will, this idealization of old America, to sell a notion of American history to a nation fervently embracing the culture of consumption as a kind of an escape from modern life. And not only did Nutting himself provide that natural, tasteful picture that he wanted to when we first started talking about Nutting tonight, when we opened up this conversation, not only did he provide that natural, tasteful picture at little expense, but he offered a set of organizing myths or historical fictions to accompany those pictures and those objects that allowed the new middle class to both consume and be consumed by their past. So it basically allowed this new middle class in America to sort of invent old America along with Wallace Nutting, and to create a collective memory for this country right at the moment where the country becomes modern and heterogeneous and something very much like what we know today. So Wallace Nutting's Old America, if you will, is an organizing myth for mid-century suburban American life. And I think what I'll do is I'll kind of stop there, and this will hopefully give us a little bit of time for some Q&A. So I'm going to stop my sharing, and I think we'll have time for some questions.
Tom, that was really wonderful. Thank you so much. I have my little Nutting behind me. So
you actually have one. Fantastic.
It was found at a thrift shop recently.
Well, that's often where you find them, as you know, thrift shops and antique stores.
Yep.
I'm tickled that you have it there.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Madison Blass. I am the executive assistant for the Museum of Old Newbury. And I would love to invite any questions for Tom that you might have. I'll ask you all to keep your cameras off and your speakers muted. But if you hover your cursor over the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little white chat box. Click on that and you can type in any questions you have for Tom. I'll read them out loud to him. So it looks like we already have our first question. This is from Claire Mitchell. And she wanted to know, Tom, would you consider Nutting more a historian or more a commercial genius?
Historian or commercial genius? Well, I don't think we have to choose either or, but I think we have to kind of recognize the very commercial underpinnings of his enterprise. I don't think, as kind of archaeologically correct as some of his furniture could be, we should lose track of the fact that it was all produced with modern tools, modern equipment, often by immigrant Italian and Scandinavian woodworkers. I don't think we should overlook the fact that even though Nutting employed Henry Charles Dean, the architect, to work on these buildings, and William Sumner Appleton did drive by, we know, and take some photographs of them, that they were clearly restored in a way that served this vision of a romantic old America more than any sort of historical accuracy or authenticity. Now, having said that, I'd also like to kind of point out that we should probably give them a little bit of a pass, because these were the earliest days of this sort of exploration of historic structures, and so it wasn't until 50 years later that we had, individuals or more like Abbott Lowell Cummings and others who really taught us how to kind of take a, more scientific approach to the study of historic structures.
Yeah, they were writing the rules of
They
preservation.
were writing the rules. That's very nicely put, Madison.
Yeah. All right. So Marthabauer, she said, "Thank you. We learned so much." And her grandfather was actually a driver of Wallace Nuttings.
Ah, like a driver of the car. So, what I had great fun. Again, many years ago, I turned the book into an exhibition when I was a curator at the Wadsworth Atheneum. And I had great fun because I got all infatuated. I have a little bit of a gearhead streak in me, gearhead tendencies. So I like automobiles. And I tracked down the fact that Wallace Nutting owned a Stevens Duryea touring car. It's a very rare touring car. They were made, I think, in Springfield, Massachusetts. And there were a few of them kind of left around, 4 or 5 of them. And there was one at Owl's Head Transportation Museum. So I actually borrowed the car and I stuck it in the middle of the exhibition. And just for fun, I don't know if you can see this, but this is actually, Nutting would take the cars with him to Europe. So that's actually a Stevens Duryea touring car that Nutting took to Europe. So I don't know if that's your grandfather in there driving it, but it was kind of a magical moment when we were able to put the car in the middle of the exhibition, and the whole kind of story, literally swirled around this idea that for the first time in the 19-teens, you could hop in a car and drive to, a little town in New England, rather than being constrained in where you're going by the tourist routes.
Right. Tourist industry completely changed. Let's see. Our next one is from Pam. Can you comment further on the timing of Wallace's success and the waves of immigrants arriving in the U.S.?
Thank you. No, very good question. So why was this all so important against a backdrop of increased immigration? And, if you first kind of approach Wallace Nutting at face value, you'll kind of say, well, this whole narrative seems like it's a little narrow, like it's sort of, excluding people from this idea of history. But what I like to point out is we need to remember that 4 individuals, and I think they were from the Harvard class of 1878, formed something called the Immigration Restriction League. And they agitated for immigration restriction all through the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. And they actually won because immigration restriction was passed by Congress right after World War I and wasn't lifted until after World War II. So what Wallace Nutting all of a sudden, against that as a backdrop, Wallace Nutting all of a sudden becomes something of a progressive, because what he's saying is we have this heterogeneous society now in America. What will the common values, what will the common history, what will the common beliefs be? What are the kind of symbols that are going to tie, everyone together in this country? And so he provides, I think, kind of this backdrop narrative to what eventually becomes, we would call it kind of, the American dream of suburbia. Now you can criticize that, and I think it's certainly, with the environmental sensitivity we have today, we can certainly ask the question: was it a good idea to move out from cities and sort of spread out into suburbia? But at the same time, I think we want to kind of view Wallace Nutting's activities as being kind of in the centrist. And I also found a series of letters which meant a lot to me, because it was Nutting defending Israel Sack, who was the great antique dealer of the 1920s and 30s and 40s, who then wrote the Good, Better, Best books. And Nutting was repeatedly sort of coming to the defense of mostly Jewish antique dealers in Boston and New York. And I quite liked that I found those letters, because it kind of opened up a little bit of a window to his personality for me.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so we have one from Amantha that said, did he ever rest? Was he ever accused of faking history? There must have been some critics.
So I think, the faking stories come later. And that's what's so interesting, because remember, Nutting wanted you to know his name. So initially he put on the furniture these paper labels on the bottom, they looked sort of antique labels. But then he realized that people were soaking the labels off and potentially passing, distressing the furniture and passing it off as period. So he started branding his name in the furniture. And he really liked that idea of, how do you kind of make everyone sure that you know your name. But the story that I love so much, if you're all familiar with Winterthur, the great museum and decorative arts collection in Delaware, Winterthur at some point in the 1950s or 60s acquired a high chair, a children's high chair painted in a wonderful dark green. And it was regarded as an icon of American furniture for years, all important. And it was on view in the galleries. I think it was published, as part of the Winterthur collection. Excuse me. So Henry Francis DuPont, who owned Winterthur, was very, very proud of this chair. And then at some point in the 1970s, someone looked in a Wallace Nutting catalog and realized it was a Wallace Nutting Windsor chair. So everyone at Winterthur got embarrassed and, branded it as a, fake, and we can't have this in the galleries anymore. And they stuck it in a closet. And Winterthur is also a training facility. They have a master's program there for curators. So then for years, the chair was used as a kind of a red herring. It was part of your connoisseurship exam at the end of your master's degree. You had to kind of catch the Wallace Nutting chair, pass the Wallace Nutting chair, and understand why it was machine made rather than handmade. And then I was very amused at some point, probably 20 years ago. All of a sudden, the chair comes back out on view as a Wallace Nutting chair, and it's celebrated again. So it made the full circuit from being, interesting to embarrassment to useful as a teaching tool, and now it's interesting again. So I like the fact that chair got rehabilitated. So I think any kind of charges of fakery when it comes to the furniture would have come later.
Okay, I love that story. Let's see. We have one that says, "Thank you, loved this. I have 14 nuttings outside. I love your nutting book and 2." So just a comment and a thank you. Margaret Welch says, "Did Nutting know any of the 10 painters like Tarbell and Benson? Fascinating that Madison placed." Oh,
I saw that you had that too. Yeah. So no, I don't think he knew them. And I was offering that comparison earlier as just a kind of way of understanding, what I take to be a fairly, kind of culturally conservative mode of representation of women in the 19 teens and 20s. And again, think about it. Women are lobbying for the right to vote, achieve the right to vote, going to college, taking jobs, as even if they're jobs like typists and stenographers, but they're in the workplace, they're in the out of the domestic sphere for the first time. And then Tarbell, Benson, Nutting, everyone else, all the imagery kind of puts them back in these hermetic environments of the historic parlor. So I think it's a specific moment. It's a little bit of sort of Thermidor-like reaction to women's rights. Let's kind of contextualize women in a slightly different way.
Right. Interesting point. All right. So we have Bob Watts, who honestly, the whole reason that you coming here today was because of a conversation Bob and I had about how much he loves Wallace Nutting. So said, "Wonderful Nutting is my hero."
Thank you, Mr. Watts.
You mentioned Framingham,
yep.
Saxonville. Consolidation there? Did he live there?
He did. So back to those kind of English sounding names. So he eventually bought a house in Framingham, which he called Nuttinghome. And then he had a factory in Framingham, and then he had a factory in Ashland above Framingham, which I think he eventually even consolidated out of that into the Framingham building. But yeah, by the end of his life, everything is going on in Framingham. And then when he dies on the eve of World War II, I always think it's fascinating that he kind of lived from the Civil War to World War II. All of his tooling was given to Berea College in Kentucky. And so Berea is known as a craft school.
Okay.
And so they then kind of carried on the Wallace Nutting name, if you will, for a while, because they were using his tools and his templates. And I like that kind of the story ends up in a positive way, an educational way as well, too.
Bob wanted to know, do you know what happened to the negatives?
Yeah, good question. So there are all sorts of stories for what happened to, Nutting, passes away. His wife dies a few years after. They're negatives and papers that are stored in a chicken coop. I've heard that story. There's a ton of material that gets sent to Berea College.
Okay.
The local history room in Framingham, the library, had a large Nutting collection, and it's actually kind of a poignant story because 10 or 15 years ago, they sold a lot of that material. They deaccessioned it, and it went out into the kind of the Nutting collectors field. I was still, must have been 15 years ago, so I was still working in Hartford, Connecticut, and I went to the auction and salvaged a bunch of it for the Wadsworth Athenaeum. So lantern slides and things like that. But his negatives themselves got distributed, quite promiscuously around New England. There was one of his last employees had many of the negatives for a while and did try to keep the photography business going for a little bit, but I think World War II probably put an end to that. And then by the 1950s, this kind of imagery would have been very old-fashioned, so it just never came back after the war.
It's always hard when things disappear into
chicken
private.
Yes.
Chicken coop. Exactly. Let's see. So Hardy asked, how much of the fad of New England and American history and antiquity style a reaction to the tremendous number of immigrants of that era? Did he employ immigrants? I think you mentioned that.
Yes.
But...
Yeah, no, he certainly did. And I think it is very much a reaction to a changing United States and a changing New England. And I think there again, it's fascinating that Nutting himself often made the case that Scandinavian and Italian cabinet makers were who he was employing because American workers by the 1920s were de-skilled. And so when he organized the furniture business in the very late teens in Saugus, and then eventually consolidated back in Framingham. If you go, I had a few kind of payroll sheets that I found for the factories, particularly late in the whole enterprise in the 1930s, and you find names like Svensson and Libertini, and so very clearly he was employing immigrant laborers. And I think it's interesting that the curriculum of manual training of woodwork that we all were so used to, those of us who went to public school. I mean, the reason I took woodshop as a kid was because in the 1920s and 30s, so many public schools adopted the Sloyd curriculum, S-L-O-Y-D, which was a Scandinavian manual training program. And so Scandinavian students would already have been trained in woodworking before they came to America. And so Nutting was then hiring fairly highly trained individuals.
Fascinating. Okay. Sally wanted to know do you know if any of Nutting's houses have been restored for more accurate authenticity?
It's funny. My first moment of trying to sort out in my own head the early preservation movement came when I was working on a master's thesis on an architect named Joseph Everett Chandler. And the reason I got interested in Chandler is I answered a little call for help from the Paul Revere House. And they put a little fellowship together for me to try to help them think about updating a historic structure report on their building. Should you restore Joseph Chandler's efforts at the building? And I took a kind of a strong stand, I remember, as a young person saying, well, we shouldn't try to re-restore these early preservation efforts because you're basically just going to keep creating a building that never was. If you do that, there's really no way to kind of reckon or re-reckon with this. So I do know, for instance, the Webb House in Wethersfield, over the years, they've put a great deal of work into conserving those murals. They were covered up for a long time. They actually were covered up because someone thought there should be period wallpaper over them. So I'm going to guess in the 1970s, there was period wallpaper put over the Nutting murals, but then more recently, they've taken that wallpaper off because that was a kind of a later attempt to re-restore the building, which doesn't make a lot of sense given that the buildings were so altered wholesale by Nutting and his architects. So if you can, in your mind's eye, go back to what the Ironmaster's house looked like when Nutting bought it versus when he sold it, it's completely a different animal.
Dramatic. It's funny how the pendulum of preservation swings back and forth. What becomes history when at first it was just a reproduction of history.
I learned last night that I guess in recent years the Antique Roadshow has added a fellow who does appraisals of things like Pokemon cards. So I hadn't realized that history has crept up on us.
Right. That's true.
So
great to think about. Anne Sullivan asks, this gave me a different perspective on Nutting and his creation of a kind of genre all his own. He made history a business, well put, but still created an accessibility that was unique.
I think accessibility, is a key word here. It's a nice point.
Yeah. Mary wanted to know, can you speak to the braided rugs in and Wallace Nutting's interiors? Yep.
So here again, that's a wonderful kind of example of an invented tradition. Because yes, braided rugs, not something we think about in period, but Nutting's wife secured the rugs. She braided them herself, but then she also created a kind of a network of women who would make the rugs. And that was also one of the ways that Nutting, I think, first got interested in Berea College, because there was a textile and a weaving program at Berea, and he approached Berea, if I remember, asking if they would make nettings for his the tester beds. And then he had another kind of craft guild somewhere that was braiding the rugs for him. So the rugs themselves appear in the furniture catalogs. You could buy them. So they're Wallace Nutting rugs. So they are prominent in the interiors, the photographs, because you could buy them. Exactly right.
Okay. Martha, she wanted to know, is there a Wallace Nutting in the MFA? My grandfather, Augustine, I'm going to say this name wrong,
Bartolucci.
Yep. Always said he had a piece of furniture there. Besides driving, he also refinished work for Mr. Nutting.
So I don't know if there is one of Nutting's reproductions at the MFA. If there is, I suspect it came later. It wouldn't have been collected back in the day. Nutting's period furniture, so the 17th and 18th century collection he put together to use as the props in the houses, that all went to the Wadsworth Athenaeum in 1926, 25 actually, and then it was accessioned in 1926 as the Morgan bequest. And then what was left of the reproduction furniture in the Framingham showroom, that all went to Berea College to be used as kind of prototypes. So I don't think there would be a kind of a Nutting reproduction piece at the MFA. There's nothing that I can think of unless it was purchased later. Over the years now, of course, SPNEA, Historic New England, has purchased objects. The Wadsworth Athenaeum certainly did when I was there. And a number of other museums have acquired objects to kind of represent that 20th century moment.
Right. Okay, and it looks like our last question from Susan. Do you know what magnitude of Nutting's photography he copied?
So Susan, this is one of these awful things, which is at one point in life I could have told you the exact number. it's something like 50,000 negatives in his office book. So his office book was a kind of a ledger at which he kept track of every negative and where it was taken. So there's something like 50,000 entries in that. And then the reason I could have told you the number is I had a fellowship at the Smithsonian American History Museum, and I spent a lot of time at the Library of Congress with an intern going through all of the copyright materials, because he not only did he copyright hundreds of them, but he then went back and reprotected them once the copyright expired. So he was very, very aware of his rights. And then he also was very quick to denounce other photographers as pirates. So if other people started producing hand-tinted photographs, he would issue these sort of stern directives that those were infringing on his copyrights.
Shrewd businessman he was.
Mm-hmm.
All right, actually we have a few more. So Phyllis wants to know what drove the consumerism you mentioned. Who was buying Nutting's goods, immigrants or established Americans?
All the above. What drove the consumerism? If we can all kind of remember what a department store meant, not just what a department store was, but what it meant. So a department store of any city of any scale was just a temple of consumer culture. And this is where you learned what fashion was. This is where you learned what good taste was. This is where you had lunch. And I'm old enough to remember every year driving. My parents would take me to G Fox in Hartford, Connecticut, and we'd buy corduroys for the school year, kind of thing. And G Fox was just an entire experience. Consumer culture, the culture of consumption, if you will. If you think about the 20th century and the trajectory that we were all on throughout the 20th century in America, it's all about how the United States becomes a consumer culture. And Wallace Nutting keenly understood where he fit in that, and keenly understood how to leverage advertising in department stores and be part of that culture.
Yeah. Okay, two more quick ones. Susan, our director, asked, did some of his pieces go to the Wellesley Inn? Do you know?
Well, so I don't know about the Wellesley Inn. You may be thinking about the Wayside Inn. And yes, that was largely furnished with Nutting reproductions. Henry Ford owned it, but then it burned. Many of you will remember, I think, in the 1950s or 60s. And I actually, at one point early on in this whole project, in storage at the old Wayside Inn, they showed me some of the kind of fragments of the burned Nutting furniture, reproduction furniture. They still had it. Wouldn't surprise me if other inns had Nutting furniture, but very famously, the Wayside Inn did.
Okay. And last quick one. So Bob wanted to know, why did he do European and other foreign countries' views?
Well, so he published, England Beautiful, Ireland Beautiful, these books. And then he also repeatedly traveled. And travel, again, was something that was prescribed to, help someone relax and help calm their nerves in this era. And he also traveled, interestingly, to the Holy Land. Remember, he's a congregational minister, so he went on a boat trip to the Holy Land. So he was fairly well traveled for an upper middle class individual of the early 20th century, and he brought his camera with him because that's what people did in that era. That was part of the experience. You went and you kind of fixed or captured the view, and then in his case, he turned around and then figured out how to kind of sell the view. I think England and Ireland kind of make a great degree of sense because he's creating a kind of ancestry for this old America as he moves forward.
All right, so I think we're going to wrap up here. I have more some comments to read to you afterwards, but before everyone leaves, I just want to remind you of our next Watching the Moon program, which will be happening April 22nd, so another Thursday, and this one will be China's Rocket Man, a deportee from the US launches China into space. which is a presentation by Tiang Fu, who is a recent alum of Governor's Academy. So that should be fascinating. And again, that's on Thursday, April 2nd at 7 p.m. So everyone's signing off. I hope we will see you there. And Tom, I want to thank you again for this wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you, Madison, and thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. This is good fun to revisit Wallace Nutting, and I thank you for the opportunity. I love spending the evening with you. Thank you.
Absolutely.